So, welcome. I'm Dr. Robert McEachnie, and this is part of an ongoing kind of attempt to share some lectures during our time of pandemic when we can't get out and share as easily. And I've been asked to present a series of lectures, it should be three, on the origins of Islam. And this is a focus that comes out of my research in late antiquity and really has become apparent within the field in the last decade or two that we need to think about Islam not as something separate, not as something on its own, not as something that comes solely out of Arabia with no predecessors, but rather as part of a larger ancient milieu, right? As related to Christianity, Judaism, and the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, and all of the things that are bound into the ancient Near East. And so that's kind of what I want to do today. But let's kind of introduce the whole setup. I want to start with the story of this person, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was the leader of ISIS until he was killed in Syria in 2019. Now, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is not his real name. His real name was Ibrahim Awad al-Badri. But when he was chosen as the leader of ISIS, he took on a new name to reflect the ideals of the group. And his name was an assertion about ISIS's goals of making a caliphate. Right? Al-Baghdadi refers to the fact that he is from Baghdad, but Abu Bakr is a reference to the first caliph, to the first successor of Muhammad when Muhammad passed away in 632. And that's a claim that the community, the Ummah, had been corrupted, and he was taking it back to its original nature, and that ISIS represented the pure form of Islam. Obviously, this is wrong, but that attempt to control the history, that attempt to connect to an idealized past is an important one. And it's a good jumping off point for us to ask, what was the actual nature of the religious movement at the death of Muhammad, during the life of Muhammad, during his immediate successors? Because whoever controls that origin story controls the group definition. What does it mean to be a Muslim? And so what I want to do is examine those origins of Islam in a little more detail. Today, we assume we know who a Muslim is. He or she is a follower of the faith which came to Muhammad and is based on the 5 pillars and the Quran, plus the accumulated beliefs, the hadiths that have developed around its teachings. And these are the 5 pillars of Islam. The Shahada, sincerely reciting the Muslim profession of faith, right? That there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Performing ritual prayers, giving alms to the needy, fasting during the month of Ramadan, which as I'm recording this is currently happening, and then the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, right? And one of the great traps of history, though, is believing, often without thinking, that what is present today has always been there in that way. And this is common. We know that college students today in 2020 can't picture the Cold War or the threat of nuclear war, right? That was so present in the 1980s, 70s, and earlier. I, being a millennial, have a hard time picturing business being done without emails or writing papers without a computer. Right? My parents, who are boomers, couldn't picture life without electricity that their parents experienced. And so it goes. It's not that we don't know these things newly exist or that we lack the context to imagine the unexpected consequences of life without them. But what about when it's not an invention that we use, but it's an abstract idea, like race? Slavery in the ancient world had no link to race, which makes it entirely different from that in the modern. But if you watch any film of the ancient world, slaves are almost always depicted with darker skin to reflect the modern reality, not as it was. And we have a hard time then picturing the past as it actually was. So here, I want to challenge us to think with creativity. What's more likely? Islam never changed, or it looked remarkably different? We know religions change. Look at the Catholic Church. 60 years ago, pre-Vatican II, you would not be able to go to a Catholic church and hear the Mass in any language other than Latin. Or examine Episcopal churches in 1960 and today. Then, churches were still segregated, had bans on dancing, and would kick boys out for having hair past their ears. Today, they accept same-sex marriage and have women as priests. What's constant there is change. And that takes us to the problem of early Islamic history, that we are largely in the dark about what the life of Muhammad and the next generation were like. Aside from the Quran, we have no written sources in Arabic until the late 8th century, decades removed from the actual events. And by that point, Muhammad was less of a man and more of a revered religious figure. In some ways, this is similar to the search for the historical Jesus. But there, the Gospels, while problematic, were written within a few decades of his life. With early Islam, there's no written sources for almost 150 years other than the Quran. As a result, Islam has always been treated as a fully formed religion, emerging from Muhammad as a whole, unique other. The conquest of both the Persian and the Byzantine empires as well, in the space of really only 8 years, remains a problem for historians as well. How and why did it happen so quickly that a group of nomads conquered not one, but 2 world empires out of seemingly nowhere? We have no good history of the struggle, the splits, the differences, the divisions, until the religion was 150 years old. Imagine we had no history of the United States written prior to 1920. It would project issues backwards. It would miss events, certainly. It would lionize certain founders and ignore others. And it would certainly seek to portray its current standing as always present. And this is exactly the case for the study of early Islam. As a result, Islamic and Western histories have either accepted these accounts and treated Islam as separate from the Near Eastern traditions or rejected them on a nihilistic base. It's only in the last few decades that a new approach emerges, which forms the basis of my lectures. And there are a couple possible solutions to this, but the most prominent one comes in 1977 by the scholar Patricia Crone, who sadly passed away a few years ago, in the book Hagarism. That is the title associated with a person that shows up in the book of Genesis, Hagar, who is the concubine of Abraham and births Ishmael. That's the title given to much of the movement in the Christian and Jewish sources that are contemporary to the birth of Islam. And it's a revisionism based on different sources. If we don't have Arabic sources, what shows up in Syriac, in Armenian, in Coptic, in Greek? And it's a recognition of sources that are tainted by intervening religious strife, that there is often no mention of Islam, no mention, though, of religious separation between those who would be followers of Muhammad and Christians. There's a recognition in the importance of Muhammad and of Arab conquests. We can also use the Quran, but without the intervening centuries of interpretation which has piled up. These are known as the Hadiths, a collection of sayings attributed to Muhammad, which clarify the Quran. But these also date from later. So if we set them aside and we read the Quran solely as the text that exists without the accumulated interpretation, what do we find? Now, to do all of that, we have to contextualize, which takes me to the second strategy. And that is, if we cannot see directly into a place or a period, we can still see around it. We can build the context. And this requires, though, a rejection of one of the established principles: Islam as other, Islam as sui generis, Islam as a class unto itself. And this is based on the religious biographies of later periods which sought to portray Muhammad as the greatest leader and Islam as superior to other religions which had come before. They didn't want the religion to spring from a shared religious milieu. They wanted it to spring from angels. But if we abandon that and allow that every history has a context, we find that actually the origin of Islam is rooted in the problems of the Near East. And that's what I want to do in this first lecture of the series, is what is the Arabian context? What is the world that the Prophet Muhammad is born into? What are the problems of it that Islam addresses? So what I propose to do is to study the context of Arabia and Muhammad, to look at the events of the century leading up to the life of Muhammad in order to see what the world was shaped, or what the world that shaped him and his message looked like. What were the struggles and what were the problems? What was the shared religious milieu like? Then, in the next lectures, or if you want to just skip ahead, we'll look at the life of Muhammad, and then the second one, the generations of followers that followed him for probably about 60 years, in order to make an argument about what the origins of Islam were and how the religion we recognize was formed. The main story here is the story of the Near East prior to and during the life of Muhammad, which was, as we'll see here and go through, multipolar. right? It was focused both towards Rome, towards India, towards Persia. It was connected via trade and culture. Arabia, by its definition, is a place of connections. And we should not forget this. Muhammad's job, prior to becoming a prophet, which isn't really a job, was he was a caravan driver. Very explicitly, he leaves his home, he goes other places, he does trade, he connects with people. It's a place that has religious disputes within an accepted framework, right? There is a generally accepted monotheism. What that means, what version of Christianity or Judaism is where disputes happen. And Arabia is not sui generis, but is part of the wider Byzantine and Persian world, right? The world that we can see here, right? And this is a messy map that comes from about that period, where we can see the two prominent dynasties, the Persian Sasanian dynasty and the Roman Empire, sometimes called Byzantium by this point, which is ruled from Constantinople, modern day Istanbul. Arabia is a bit of a messier place, right? But I want to focus really on the south end of the Arabian Peninsula and the battle for supremacy between two places, Himyar, which we associate with modern day Yemen, and Aksum, that we associate with Ethiopia. That these two great kingdoms have been battling for control over the Bab el-Mandab, the strait here that connects the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, for decades, if not centuries. I want to focus on those two because they really represent how Arabia ties into the broader world. So first, Himyar. Himyar was the most established kingdom in the Arabian Peninsula. Dating back to at least the 4th century CE, the kingdom, located in present-day Yemen, was a major force in trade, controlling the strait. Himyar acted as a point of entry into the Red Sea and thus to the Mediterranean world and to Europe beyond, for Indian spices, for silk, for goods that move much more quickly than moving overland over the desert. Now, to maintain such a population, water networks were constructed for irrigation, and most important was the Great Dam of Marib, right, which you see the city of Marib here in the Himyarite kingdom. These are the ruins of the Dam of Marib. And now it pre-existed the Himyarites dating back to probably the 5th century BCE at least. But the Himyarites undertook a further reconstruction, creating a structure that's 14 meters high, with extensive waterworks at both the northern and the southern ends, 5 spillway channels, a 1,000-meter canal to distribution tank that allowed the irrigation of over 25,000 acres. Despite the increases in height, the dam suffered numerous breaches at different points throughout the 5th and the 6th century, and the last recorded repairs took place in 557. The dam was destroyed probably around 575 and never rebuilt. It's actually noted in the Quran, and the subsequent failure of the irrigation system led to the mass exodus of up to 50,000 people. We should note the dam was actually rebuilt in the 1970s, and you can see images here of how it allows Yemen, which is otherwise a not so fertile place, to produce huge crops. Now, more important for today's lecture, we should note that Himyar seems to have had a ruling family which converted to Judaism sometime in the early 5th century. This makes it the only independent Jewish state between 70 and 1948. One part of that is fascinating is how the development parallels a similar one just across the Bab el-Mandab, right? So if we have a Himyarite Jewish kingdom, Aksum, ancient Ethiopia, have been an important force since at least the 1st century, but in the early 4th century converts to Christianity. It occupies modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea and dominated the Red Sea and controlled the trade between the Nile and the Red Sea, acting as an intermediary between Rome and India. And in fact, the Romans identified it in the 3rd century as one of 4 world empires, themselves, the Persians, the Chinese, and the Ethiopians. The main port, Adulis, right, acted as the primary trade center for African goods, including ivory, gold, emeralds, and agricultural goods. And the capital, Aksum on the plateau, was well protected and never suffered a direct assault. It was the most developed civilization in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, we should say, with a state religion, written language in the form of bees, trade, economic networks, culture. Now, the kingdom officially converted to Christianity before Rome. In the year 325, the king Ezana converted and placed the cross on all coinage. You can see this change over time he goes from this crescent to a cross that he adds to the coinage, specifically to display his Christianity. And Christianity was widely practiced by the end of the 5th century and is memorialized by numerous stone churches, which in Ethiopia, which are still in use today if you visit Addis Ababa. Now, why the timing similarity, that one is becoming Christian, one's becoming Jewish at the same time in the 4th, 5th century? Both kingdoms began to claim stronger and larger titles for their kings and asserting who they ruled over with greater openness. It occurs in both countries in the language of Sabak, a dialect of Yemen, which Ethiopic inscriptions also use alongside the Greek. Both sides, Aksum and Himyar, were allying themselves with stronger powers and aligning into a two-power world. And we could have an analogy here to what happens in the middle of the 20th century, where you have the United States and the Soviet Union on opposite sides. And many countries aligned themselves with one or the other by economic means, by cultural means, by religious means. Here we have Aksum aligning itself with Rome, Himyar aligning itself against Rome, against Christianity, with Persia, right, their trade partner. And so even though the Aksumites were Monophysites, Coptic Christians, and the Himyarites were Jewish, the move towards monotheism signaled a unity in each kingdom, and either a break or alliance with the Roman Empire. And it's here we can think about trade as one of the primary issues that have to do with this whole thing. This is a map of the so-called Silk Road. First off, there is no such thing as a Silk Road, right? Rather, there's a bunch of routes that connect to China. And I like this map in particular because it emphasizes the water map, that we like to glamorize the idea of the Silk Road. There was a whole magazine in the New York Times this past week about the Silk Road. More goods moved over water than over land. And this simply makes sense, right? If you are walking with donkeys, with horses, you can move maybe 20 miles in a day. If you're moving over water, you do that in 2 hours. You don't stop at night. So the oversea route is far more important, but is often ignored. The oversea route is not without its own problems, right? And so here we want to focus on how things move across the Indian Ocean. From the subcontinent, there's two paths to reach the Mediterranean, either to the Persian Gulf, up the Tigris and Euphrates, which means moving under Persian control, or through the Bab el-Mandab, up the Red Sea to the Nile and out. And the role of these two routes are extremely important. The easier one, honestly, is through the Persian Gulf, up the Euphrates, which takes you to modern-day Syria, and maybe 100 miles from the Mediterranean. But it moves through a different empire if you're Roman. And the Persian Empire attempts to set up trading colonies along the Persian Gulf and as far as Sri Lanka in an attempt to control this trade route. Okay? And this really has an effect in attempting to stifle the trade to Rome. The Persians control it, set up tariffs that cut off this trade. Their best option is to sail around Arabia and to India directly. But this has a choke point, the Bab el-Mandab. And if the Himyarites in Yemen are allies of the Persians, it cuts off that trade route, and the Romans have no choice but to pay the Persian tariffs. And so, in the year 525, Aksum, the ally of Rome, invades Himyar to unite both sides of the strait under Roman proxy control. Now, that said, there's also a religious impetus for this invasion. Both sides found their unique identity in religion more than anything else. And so while there is a trade war here, there's also a religious war. One of the things that happened the year before in 524 is that the Jewish king of Himyar tried to exterminate Christian communities in the kingdom. And he says, right, when Dunuwas, ruler of the Himyarite tribe in South Asia and a Judaizer, took power, he sought to blot out Christianity, especially at Najran, a Christian city. Against the counsels of Arethius, chief man of Najran, the city surrendered to Dunuwas, which immediately broke the word he had given and sought to compel the city to renounce Christ. Led by St. Arethius, hundreds of martyrs, including women, children, and babies, violently withstood his threats and were beheaded and burned. This offers impetus to the Christian king of Aksum, Caleb, to invade. It does seem that this massacre did happen. It is recorded in numerous ways, and with the voice of Yusuf, the Himyarite king. Why Yusuf tries to boast of his murderous actions seems to be to obtain Persian approval, but it isn't forthcoming. Right? The Persians don't back him, and instead he is subject to an invasion by King Caleb. We could note here as well that the Romans themselves don't bother to invade either, and that's because the Christians who are killed here are Monophysite Christians. And I'm not going to get into the theology here, but suffice to say they were a different brand, in modern terms, a different denomination of Christians than the Orthodox Chalcedonian Roman Christians. Right? They believed a slightly different thing about Jesus that within the Roman Empire would have led to them being considered heretics and suffer punishments in the form of fines and reductions in liberty as a result. So in some ways, the Byzantines don't care. They say these are heretics who got what was coming to them, but they can use it as a pretext to control the trade route. And so while the Chalcedonian court in Constantinople shows little interest in sending military aid to overseas Monophysites, it was not averse to inciting others, Ethiopians in particular, to act. And the historian Procopius of the 6th century was explicit about this. He said, the Emperor Justinian had the idea of allying himself with the Ethiopians and the Himyarites in order to work against the Persians. And so the deeply rooted ambition of the Axumites under King Caleb to recover Ethiopian rule in Arabia was not lost, right, on the Romans. And so the Ethiopians were persuaded to act. The burning at Najran occurred in 523. The announcement of this massacre in 524, and Caleb's army invaded Axum in 525. The story goes that Yusuf had a great chain made, which was held up by boards by which he could blockade the coast, but it could not prevent the landing. Yusuf was overthrown, and an Ethiopian Christian was promptly installed in his place. Caleb, whom we see here in a later depiction that's actually at Yale University, supposedly retired after this conquest to a monastery. He sent his crown to Jerusalem to be placed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The two kingdoms split, Axum and Himyar, but they both maintained good relations with Rome and were Christian for the next 50 years. A small side note here on Judaism, many cities and tribes throughout Arabia, particularly Yemen, remained Jewish in Muhammad's time and throughout the early Islamic period and into the 20th century. Jews remained in Yemen until about 1950, when about 50,000 immigrated to Israel. As of 2013, only about 400 Jews remained in Yemen, the rest having left for Israel. But one major takeaway here is the presence of both monotheistic religions and variations on them in Arabia. Arabia was not a backwards place inhabited by pagan Bedouins only, that was dominated by polytheism, which is how it's often portrayed in early Islamic sources, that Muhammad destroys the idols and rescues them from polytheism. Indeed, we find the opposite to be true. Monotheism and the debates about monotheism between religions was the norm. Muhammad certainly, as a caravan driver, was more than familiar with these groups and seems to be much more connected to them than previously acknowledged. Not to give too much away for the next two lectures, but we'll see that his early movement has far more in common with Judaism than what it does with what Islam will look like by 777. Now, the invasion from Ethiopia of Caleb gave Christianity to the region for a period of roughly 50 years and allowed not only the king in Axum, but the emperor in Constantinople, as well as the Shah of Sasanian Persia, to become major forces in dictating the politics and religion of Arabia. The route around Arabia was open for trade so long as Himyar was Christian dominated and Byzantine aligned. A brief interlude here, plague. And if you're interested, I have another two lectures actually, on YouTube that you can look at about the whole history of the Justinianic plague in 541. What I'll highlight here is that the plague more than likely comes either from China or from Ethiopia, or south of Ethiopia, the Rwandan highlands, or across the Indian Ocean, but enters the Mediterranean world via this trade route, right? Through the Bab el-Mandab, into the Red Sea, up the Nile, and then spreads. And it spreads mainly to coastal cities. Where does it not go? The center of Arabia. It does decimate Axum and Ethiopia, but we see very little record of it penetrating to the hotter regions of the Arabian Desert. It's going to be an important point that while much of the world suffers a really devastating plague that sees in some places mortality of 25%, Arabia, Mecca, doesn't, right? So to kind of recap and bring this together, we see here a bipolar world with related states that is Persian dominated for economy, that is trade routes that will flow through Persia, but Byzantine dominated for culture as religion spreads from that region. This bifurcation, culture looking to the west, to Rome, economy looking to the east, to Persia, to India, was unsustainable. And this is demonstrated partially in an event which spans the line between history and legend. In 552, Abraha, the Christian king of Himyar, launched a great expedition into central Arabia, north of Najran and south of Mecca. Tradition holds that Abraha undertook an attack on Mecca itself with the aim of taking possession of the Kaaba. He probably also sought to overtake the primary land trade route which could bypass the Red Sea. The tradition of Arabic commentary claims that Abraha's forces were led by an elephant and that they were miraculously repelled by a flock of birds who dropped rocks on the heads of the elephant. Abraha's assault on the ancient holy place is thought to have occurred in the very year that Muhammad was born, 570, and the path over which Abraha's elephant and men are believed to have marched is known even today in local legend as the Road of the Elephant. Now, the last point about birds dropping rocks on elephants might be legend, but the original assault at conquering the Central Arabian tribes certainly happened. The forces at work in Himyar and throughout the region made the Arabs important for the first time to the balance of power in the region. After 570, the dam at river broke and Abraha's reign ended, and Himyar was conquered by a Persian governor in 575, which changes the trade route again. It cuts off the Red Sea. Instead, the only way to avoid Persian dominance of trade routes was to go overland with camel caravans, one of the primary drivers of which was the Prophet Muhammad. And so to understand Muhammad and the religion that comes from his teachings, we have to see the problems of the world that he lived in. In many ways, the Caliphate and Islam were solutions to these problems. A multipolar world that pulled in different directions, Rome as a center of culture, Persia as the center of trade. Religious disputes between different monotheists, often over theological details that were lost on the average person, between Monophysites and Nestorians and Chalcedonian Christians. Finally, Arabia survives the plague better than most. Those things together mean that when Muhammad comes on the scene, he is responding to problems that are present for many people already, right? And we need to see his teachings and the religion that develops after his death as a response to that. And we'll see that maybe in the story of life, a story of Muhammad as a child that we'll start with in the next lecture.